Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are turning in from. This is the final session of Mishnah in Depth Bava Metzia with Dr. Rachel Furst. This course is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division and is sponsored in her memory by her family. This is part of Drisha's Mishnah Yomit learning, working with the most standard daily Mishnah study schedule. You will dedicate time independently each day for the study of 1 to 2 mishnayot, and come together for this. And in support of your independent learning, we will have a weekly be'iyun shiur, where you'll have the opportunity to review portions of last week's material and to go deeper into select elements of the text. And we are for one more time, we are learning with Dr. Rachel Furst, who we're always happy to have back. She is a scholar of Jewish law and Jewish history who research and focus is on Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, as well as women and gender. She is joining us for the last class in the series. The previous week's session was pre-recorded and the link was sent out to students. If you do not find it, please email inquiry@drisha.org and I will point you in the right direction. There will not be source sheets for this class. Instead, there will be a PowerPoint shared on screen. And with that, I want to hand things off to Dr. Furst for the day.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to everyone who has joined us for this last session. This is actually our 8th week of learning together. And for those of you who are following the Mishnah Yomit schedule, this past week, you will have learned chapter 9 of Bava Metzia. And I believe actually today we start with chapter 10. And since chapter 10 is a relatively short chapter, we will finish that up on Tuesday, and on Wednesday begin our study of Bava Batra. And the class today will therefore focus mostly on chapter 9, but also give you a little preview of chapter 10 to round out our study of this Masechet. Okay, let me share my screen with you just a moment. Okay. Okay, so chapter 9 of Tractate Bava Metzia focuses primarily on different types of relationships between, I suppose you could still call them employers and employees, which continues some of the subject matter of the previous chapters. But in this chapter, we're focusing on 2 different kinds of employer-employee relationships. The first section of the chapter focuses on what in halachic parlance is often called kablanut, or a poel kablan, by which we mean someone who is hired. A poel kablan is a laborer who is hired on the basis of the job, as opposed to a poel sachir, and that's the focus of the second part of this chapter, a laborer who is hired to work on an hourly basis rather than on the basis of a specific task or a specific job. Now, interestingly, in part A, which, as I said, focuses on the poel kablan or kablanut, someone who is hired to work on the basis of a job, a specific job, the classic example that the Mishnah provides and really delves into is hamikabel sadeh michavero, someone who receives a field from another person and is then expected to work it. This is a concept that we in English would probably call sharecropping. In other words, we're talking about someone who receives a field from another person and provides the owner with an agreed upon amount of produce. So in other words, they receive the use of the field, they receive the field in order to work, And the agreement is, in exchange for receiving this field for a fixed amount of time, they agree to provide, as I said, to provide the owner of the field with an agreed upon amount of produce. And that agreed upon amount can be either a certain percentage of whatever crop they managed to produce, or it can be a fixed quantity of that crop, a certain measure of that crop. And that really depends on the particular type of agreement between this sharecropper and the owner of the field. Let's take a look at a few of the mishnayot that provide us with these laws of sharecropping. You'll notice that it becomes a common refrain among all of these mishnayot. Each one of them begins with this opening phrase, "Hamikabel sadeh michavero," again, one who receives a field from another person. Mishnayot 1 and 2 that we're about to take a look at really focus on the sharecropper's rights and obligations. So here in Mishnah number 1, we have Hamikabel sadeh michavero, one who receives a field from another. The halacha is as follows: Makom shenahagu liktzor yiktzor, la'akor ya'akor, lacharosh al-charav yacharosh, right? So this means in a location where those who are cultivating the land are accustomed to cut the produce, this particular sharecropper is also obligated to cut the produce. And that's as opposed to when someone takes this field in a location where the norm is to uproot the produce. As opposed to cutting the produce, the norm is to uproot it, right? Rather than cutting it, as you see here, with a sickle or a scythe. So then the sharecropper is also obligated to uproot it as opposed to cut it. And similarly, if the norm in this particular place is to plow the land after harvesting in order to prepare it for the next crop, then the sharecropper is also obligated to plow it. And the Mishnah then goes ahead to state the basic principle here, which is Hakol Kiminhag Hamedina, all, in this case, farming of the land, right? Everything, but here all farming of the land, shall be conducted in accordance with regional custom. And that, of course, that principle, Hakol Kiminhag Hamedina, is a principle that we know from various different halachic fields and pertains here as well. The Mishnah here rounds out the picture by telling us that that just as the sharecropper and the owner of the field divide up the product, the actual agricultural crop that is produced in this field, the halacha also requires them to divide the byproducts. So, for example, the stubble and the straw, right? And similarly, they would have to divide in fields where it's basically a vineyard, right? Just as they would divide the wine, so too they are obligated to divide the branches that are pruned from these vines and the poles, again, the byproducts of the agricultural crop as well as the agricultural crop itself. And the very last example that's provided here by the Mishnah is that the landowner and the one cultivating the field both are obligated to divide the responsibility for providing poles. This is, again, we're talking about in a vineyard. These are poles that support the vines, right? If this is a vineyard that is being cultivated for the first time, so those, the supports for the vines are not in place, then much as with the crop itself and the byproducts, as we said several times, they are also obligated to share the costs for setting up the field, for basically for providing these poles that support the vines. The second Mishnah, again, continues on with this discussion of the responsibilities and the obligations of the sharecropper. Again, you'll notice that the Mishnah begins with Hamikabel sadeh michavero, one who receives a field from another. And here, in this particular Mishnah, the focus is on assumptions about the field or agreed upon premises concerning various unique features of the field that is being cultivated by the sharecropper. So, for example, the Mishnah tells us that if someone receives a field from another to cultivate, and it's an irrigated field, meaning a field that has water channels running through it, or it's a field that has trees growing in it. Now, these, both the irrigation ditches and the trees, are assumed to be sort of boons for the sharecropper, meaning features that will ultimately benefit the sharecropper. Obviously, the irrigation channels will help this sharecropper in watering the fields, and the trees will provide the sharecropper presumably with an extra byproduct, right, with extra produce. So assuming that the sharecropper has acquired a field with these unique features, if it turns out, if they just happen to be features of the field, and the sharecropper did not at any point in time indicate that he or she was taking the field specifically because of these unique features, then if these features disappear, right, if, for example, the irrigation ditches dry up, or the trees were cut down, presumably by someone who is neither the sharecropper nor the owner of the field, then the sharecropper basically doesn't have any complaints, right? He can't subtract from the produce he owes the owner. It's not that he can hold the owner accountable for these features, because the sharecropper never indicated that he was renting this field specifically due to these unique features. The last part of the Mishnah clarifies that if the sharecropper, or cultivator here, says to the landowner explicitly, I want to lease an irrigated field, or this particular irrigated field, or lease me this field with the trees, right, indicating that those unique features are the main attraction, right? That's the reason he wants this particular field. Then the owner becomes responsible for providing those features. And if the irrigation ditches dry up, or if the fields, if the trees in the fields were cut down, then in fact the sharecropper can subtract from the produce that he owes, because the owner becomes responsible for making sure those features are indeed part of the deal. Similarly, skipping forward, again, just to give us a picture of the different kinds of responsibilities and obligations of this agreement, this type of sharecropping agreement, Mishnah number 4 of the chapter, once again, hamikabel sadeh michavero, right? Someone who received a field from another. And in this case, we're talking about somebody, a sharecropper who leases a field, v'lo ratza lanakesh, and he decides he doesn't really want to weed this field, right? In other words, he rents the field, and then he changes his mind about actually wanting to use the field for a productive purpose, right? Decides that, in fact, he does not want to work this field in, the normative way. And he says to the owner of the land, "Ma ichpat lecha," right? What do you care what I do with this field? What do you care if I neglect this field, if I don't weed the field? Ho'il ve'ani noten lecha chachora, right? Because either way, I will give you the amount of produce that I have agreed to give you, right? Again, the agreement could have been a percentage of the crop, but the agreement could have been a fixed amount of crop. So presumably, if someone is now deciding that they do not want to work the field that they have rented, then presumably they're not going to be able to give a percentage of the ensuing crop, but they could still, in theory, provide a fixed amount of crop, right? So the tenant farmer says to the owner of the field, you'll get your money regardless, right? Or you'll get your produce regardless. So what do you care if I neglect the field? And the Mishnah says, en shom'in lo, right? That is not a valid argument on the part of this sharecropper. Why? Mipnei sheyachol lomar lo lemachar ata yotzeh mimena uma'ala lefanai asavim. Because the owner of the field could say, listen, I only agreed to lease you this field on the understanding that you were going to work it properly, right? If you don't work it for the year, if you neglect it, then that does affect me, because you're going to leave me at the end of the period, the end of the year, let's say, with a field that is now full of weeds and is going to actually reduce the productivity, reduce the value of this field for future years. And so the Mishnah underscores here that if someone makes an agreement to lease this particular field, the sharecropper is in fact responsible to do the work, to work the field in the manner that was assumed, that was agreed upon with the owner. This is actually similar, right? That was Mishnah number 4, chapter 9:4. But this principle is similar to one that we see in Mishnah 8 of the chapter. Here we're talking about, again, hamekabel sadeh michavero, a person who leases or receives this field from another person. And here the discussion is, what are the rights of the sharecropper, of the tenant farmer, with regards to the specific crop that he or she may plant in the field. And here too, there is an assumption that different kinds of crops have different impacts or effects on the field. And the sharecropper may only plant that which was agreed upon from the outset, assuming, right, and there are two opinions in this Mishnah. There's the opinion of the Tanna Kama, the unnamed first opinion in the Mishnah, as opposed to the opinion of Rabban Gamliel, right? So Rabban Gamliel is of the opinion that whatever they agreed upon from the outset with regards to the specific type of crop to be planted, that is what pertains, right? The sharecropper may not change the type of crop. The Tanna Kama, on the other hand, feels that rules that the crop may not be changed only in the event that the new crop that the sharecropper wishes to plant is going to be harder on the ground, is going to be tougher on the land than the crop that had been agreed upon. So for example, right, hamekabel sadeh michavero lezar'a se'orim, someone who receives a field in order to plant it with barley, that's what they agreed upon, or that was the crop that had always been planted in this field. Lo yizar'ena chitim, right? He may not change his mind and plant it with wheat, because wheat is a tougher crop than barley. It weakens the field, it weakens the soil more than the barley does. And so that's considered an inappropriate use of the land. However, the opposite, according to Tanna Kama, is okay. If the sharecropper leased a field in order to plant wheat, which is again a lighter, an easier crop on the field, then it's okay if the sharecropper changes his mind and decides to plant. I'm sorry, I said that a little bit incorrectly, right? If the sharecropper had received the field on the understanding that he was going to plant wheat, which is a tough crop, then it's okay, according to the Tanna Kama, to plant barley instead, for him to change his mind to plant barley, because barley is an easier crop on the field. So it doesn't really affect the field, or if anything, it affects the field for the better. It's lighter on the field or easier on the field to plant barley, and that is okay, according to the Tanna Kama. Again, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel forbids this, because according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the original agreement is what pertains, and the sharecropper may not change the particular crop that he intends to plant. The Mishnah goes on to say, similarly, if the sharecropper Tvu'ah agrees to plant grain, lo yizar'ena kitnit, then he cannot suddenly decide to plant it with legumes. Again, for similar principle, because the legumes are assumed to be tougher on the soil, tougher on the field than the grains. Kitnit yizar'ena tvu'ah. But according to the Tanna Kama, again, this is the same principle as we saw in the first half of the Mishnah. If the sharecropper received the field on the understanding that he would plant legumes, which are a tougher crop on the soil of the field, then it's okay if he changes his mind and decides to plant an easier crop, right? The tvu'ah, the easier crop is in, right, easier on the field. And here again, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel oser, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel just sticks to his principle, which is that the original agreement is what pertains. Right? So again, as I said, this is a sort of similar principle to what we saw in Mishnah number 4, insofar as there is an understanding that the sharecropper is really expected to work the field in a particular manner. And there's really there are limits to how the to the sharecropper's ability to change his or her mind with regards to what they want to do with that field afterwards. One other Mishnah that I want to highlight in this series is Mishnah number 7. Mishnah number 7, Hamikabel Sadeh Michavero, again, the case of the sharecropper who receives a field from another. In this case, we're talking about a sharecropper, Hamikabel Sadeh Michavero be'asara kol chitim l'shana, right? He takes this field in agreement, in return for agreeing to pay a certain measurement of wheat per year, these 10 kol, right? That he agrees to pay per year. And then, as you know, as happens sometimes, it was a bad year and the field was blighted. The produce didn't work out, right? Maybe there was a disease that infected the crops or something else like that. The question is, right, the agreement had been that the sharecropper was going to provide the owner of the field with a specific measurement of wheat, this 10 kor. And in fact, in a case like this, if that was the agreement, then it is the sharecropper's tough luck, right? The sharecropper is stuck providing this 10 kor of wheat, regardless of what happens to the crop. On the other hand, right, in this particular case, right, the agreement usually between the sharecropper and the owner seems to have been that the produce that the sharecropper would provide would come from the produce that specific field produced, right? That was the understanding. The sharecropper was going to work this field and was going to give the owner either a certain percentage or a fixed amount of the produce from that specific field. So if we look at it from that perspective, then lakta noten lo mitocha, right? If the crop was not a great crop, right? The crop got infected and it produced something, but it didn't produce very high quality wheat or whatever was planted there, right? Then actually it's the owner's tough luck, right? Meaning the sharecropper is only obligated to provide this fixed amount, this 10 kor, from the produce from that specific field. And so the owner will get, you know, low grade, low quality produce. And that makes sense, given the continuation of the Mishnah, which says, Hayu chitea yafot, lo yomar lo hareni lokeach min hashuk, ela noten lo mitocha. Right? Given that they made this agreement, or the understanding between them was that the produce that the sharecropper provided would be from this very field, then if it was a good year and the field produced very high quality crop, then certainly the sharecropper may not suddenly say to the owner, oh, you know what? I'll get you some wheat from the shuk, from the marketplace. I'm going to keep this particular wheat for myself. I'll just get you some other, presumably lower grade wheat from the shuk. The sharecropper may not do that either. In the event that this field produced a bumper crop, then that's the good luck of the owner, and the sharecropper is obligated to provide, wheat from this field in the amount specified as they agreed from the beginning. And again, as I said, the chapter, there are a couple more mishnayot that discuss this relationship between the sharecropper and the owner, all different facets of that relationship. And I just wanted to show you this overview of the chapter. And you can see here pretty clearly that mishnayot 1 through 10 are all, right, first of all, literarily, it's very striking that every single one of those mishnayot begins with this phrase, hamikabel sadeh michavero. And in fact, all of them, all of these 10 mishnayot deal with various aspects of the relationship, the legal relationship between the field owner and the sharecropper. Now, as I said at the outset, again, the Mishnah, this chapter is not divided evenly between the two subject matters. But I did say at the outset that the first part of the chapter, and that's again mishnayot, as you can see here, mishnayot 1 through 10, deals with again this sharecropper topic, or really an aspect of what in halachic parlance we call poel kablan, right? Someone who's hired on the basis of the particular job that they're doing. And the second part of the chapter deals with a poel sachir, someone who's hired on the basis of hourly wages. And that sort of, that perspective may explain why these last, right, that relationship between those two different kinds, or the contrast between those two different kinds of employer-employee relationships, may explain why the Mishnah seems to take a sharp turn for the chapter seems to take a sharp turn for these last three mishnayot, and talk about a seemingly completely different topic, which is the timely payment of workers. The last Mishnah deals with limitations on taking security pawns. We'll see how that is related to the timely payments of workers as soon as we turn to look at the verses. Right, as we've said numerous times, one of the striking features of Tractate Bava Metzia is that the majority of laws that this particular tractate deals with do have a solid biblical basis. We've seen in most of our classes, we've therefore gone back and looked at the verses in the Torah that provide the basis for these mishnayot, or for the topics in these mishnayot. And I want to do that again here too, not with regards to the first part of this chapter, which does not have a very clear biblical basis, but with regards to the second part of the chapter, this timely payment of workers. And what I'm talking about, there's two distinct biblical sources for this halakha. Excuse me, oops, I just jumped ahead on it inadvertently. The first source, as you can see here, is Leviticus, or Vayikra, chapter 19. Now, I provided you with more verses than we actually need to find the source of this law, because I want you to see how this halakha is embedded in the broader context in Sefer Vayikra. The particular verse that is of relevance to us, that has to do with the wages, is verse number 13, as you can see here. Lo ta'ashok et re'echa v'lo tigzol, lo talin peulat sachir itcha ad boker. You shall not defraud your fellow Israelite, right? It says re'echa, but the assumption is that fellow here means fellow Israelite. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until the morning. Right, so this is the halakha, the rule that one is obligated to pay. Again, here we're talking about a laborer who is working by the hour, right? We're imagining here a laborer who, really has to go out every day and look for a job. This is not someone who has any kind of long-term contract, a day laborer.
There's also
really
one in Devarim, no?
We're going to get to Devarim in just a minute, okay? We're first taking a look at these verses in Vayikra, but we're going to see, yes, as you suggested, that there is a parallel to this in Devarim as well. Before we get to Devarim, I want to take a look, as I said, what is the context, the context in which this rule appears in Vayikra. Then we're going to do the same for Devarim and talk about the differences between these sources. So in Vayikra, right, if we backtrack 2 verses, chapter 19 of Vayikra, which is in Parashat Kedoshim, says, you shall not steal, you shall not, excuse me, I cannot even see my own screen here, you shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another, you shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God, I am Hashem. And again, this is the refrain throughout chapter 19 of Sefer Vayikra, Ani Hashem keeps repeating itself, as we'll see. Then again, the verse that we just read, verse 13. But the chapter goes on to say, you shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God, I am Hashem, again the refrain. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kin fairly. Do not deal basely with members of your people. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow Israelite. I am Hashem. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. This is again the famous Lo tisna et achicha bilevavecha hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Right, you shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your fellow Israelite as yourself. Ani Hashem. So, and the reason that I provided all these verses is because the next question that I want to pose to us is, what does it seem is the impetus or the reason behind this specific mitzvah, right? The specific mitzvah about not keeping the wages of the laborer with you until morning. What seems to be the impetus for that charge here in Vayikra? Given this context in which it is embedded.
I think it's
Why does the
inequity.
Torah require that?
I think it's inequity. And you think that you can get away with it. It seems all of it is, it's unknown what you're doing. Don't hate in your heart. Don't render an unfair decision. It's the poor against the rich. It's don't profit, lifnei iver lo titein michshol. It's things that you think you can get away with.
Okay, so I agree with you. Yes, I don't mean to cut you off, but yes, I agree with you that there seems to be a sort of common theme here about not doing things that are ethically wrong, even if you could get away with them, right? I just wanna add a slight caveat to what you said, which is what verse 15 here says is, do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Right? It's actually the poor who are not supposed to be favored according to that verse. Right? So it does not seem like this chapter is particularly concerned with the poor, right? Because the poor are also singled out here as not deserving of special treatment. And I want to underscore that because we're about to turn to the psukim in Sefer Dvarim and Deuteronomy that you mentioned before, and we're going to see there that the context of the charge of the mitzvah is actually different, is distinct.
But here,
What
it's
other things
things that aren't, that you can't be held accountable for, things that are not concrete, I think, in some sense. I don't exactly know how to articulate.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way that you said it beforehand, right? Some of these things, it seemed, again, I guess the the insulting the deaf, placing a stumbling block before the blind is the most obvious example of situations where it seems like you could probably take advantage and maybe even get away with it,
right?
But you're not ethically allowed to do that, right? This is
right.
And again, Ani Hashem, Ani Hashem, Ani Hashem, which is the refrain here, according to some commentators at least, underscores, the sense that even if no other human beings will, be aware of what you're doing, God is there and God is aware. Yes, Kayla, I'm sorry, you had something to say.
I just want to highlight something from the chat if there's the time for that.
Please.
From Miriam Smirnov, quote, building a sense of community, Kol Yisrael Avarim. Miriam, do you want to comment on any context for that?
Thank you. I was about to ask whether anyone noticed other refrains here in this chapter. Excuse me, and that is the one that I also took note of and wanted to highlight, right? Beginning with, again, our verse number 13, Lo ta'ashok et re'echa, as we said, right? That it is your fellow, right? This re'echa is underscored. And we see that comes up again, particularly in verses 16 and 17, right? Members of your people, your kinsfolk, your kin. And again, in verse 18, members of your people, right? It seems like Vayikra here is really emphasizing that all of these charges and rules are ways of fostering, as you said, fostering community, making sure that society, like our society, is built in an ethical and in a proper way. Any other themes or refrains that anybody has noted here? Right, so it seems like from Vayikra, that is the backdrop to the particular mitzvah that we're interested in about not keeping the wages of a laborer overnight until the morning, right? That also seems to be part of this broader attempt to create a just society, right? That it's a particular charge with regards to people in our society. And that is all perhaps in contrast to what we see in, as we said, Sefer Devarim. Now I want to take a look at the next source, the second source for this mitzvah in the Torah itself. And that is, as you see here, Deuteronomy 24. Now here too, I provided you with a little bit, I started a few verses earlier in order to provide you with a little bit of the context. Here in Deuteronomy, the Torah says, when you make a loan of any sort to your compatriot, you may not enter the house to seize the pledge. You must remain outside while the party to whom you made the loan brings the pledge out to you. If that party is needy, you shall not go to sleep in that pledge, assuming it's a garment. You must return the pledge at sundown so that its owner may sleep in the cloth and bless you, and it will be your merit before your God. Right? And here, by the way, as we saw just a few moments ago, the very last Mishnah in our chapter deals with that mitzvah. And that's, that's the connection. That's what it's doing here. But for our purposes right now, what we're interested primarily in is verses 14 and 15. You shall not abuse a needy and destitute laborer, whether a fellow Israelite or stranger in one of the communities of your land. You must pay out the wages due on the same day before the sun sets, for the worker is needy and urgently depends on it, else a cry to God will be issued against you and you will incur guilt. So let's take a step back and think about, again, the basic mitzvah is the same, right? That you must pay out the wages that are due on the same day, just as we saw. That was certainly the gist of the mitzvah in Vayikra as well. But what do you notice is different about the presentation here of that mitzvah here in Deuteronomy? Or what is especially striking to you about the reasoning provided here in Deuteronomy?
It humanizes it, and
What do you mean by that?
it gives you a whole setting. It gives you the situation, it paints a picture for you, and it evokes that he might cry out, lest he cry out for you, cry out about it against you.
Okay, so it definitely evokes more pathos, you could say, than
Right.
the verses in the presentation of this mitzvah in Vayikra here, right? We can almost imagine the scenario. We can,
You can visualize.
the Torah is really painting for us the scene, which, perhaps plays on our emotions, and really sort of appeals to our sense of justice and explains why it is so important not to keep the wages overnight. What about the characterization of this laborer whose wages may not be kept overnight? Who is the laborer in Devarim, and who is the laborer here who is the laborer in Vayikra, and who is the laborer here in Devarim?
Here he's described as needy and destitute. He's not described that way.
As needy and destitute. Now, again, I'm going to flip back to Vayikra for one moment. As I said, in Vayikra also, the understanding is that we're talking about a day laborer, usually a day laborer, someone who has no sort of long-term contract or no sense of security from day to day. That's not somebody who's very well off, right? Not, almost by definition, that's not somebody who's at the high end of the labor spectrum, right? If we think back to our different categories from Tractate Bava Metzia, right? This is not a skilled craftsperson who can sort of be assured of work. This is somebody who really is working on an hour-to-hour, on a day-to-day basis. And that's true here in Vayikra also, but you're right to note that here, the laborer, the specifics of who the laborer is, and particularly of the the financial means of the laborer are not the focus, right? And as opposed to in Devarim, which really highlights that we're talking about somebody who is needy and destitute, as by the way, Devarim did in the previous verses, where it highlights that that point with regards to this person who has given a pledge as well, right? We're talking about someone who perhaps only has one cloak. That's the cloak that this man needs to sleep in, but it's also the only thing that he really has to give as a pledge. So certainly, right, we're talking about somebody who is really desperate, who is really quite needy and destitute. What else about the character of this laborer is highlighted in Deuteronomy?
Says
We
he's
all want to
needy
be
and
the
urgently depends on it.
Okay, so again, definitely needy, destitute, dependent, all of those things are definitely true. But what else do the verses here tell us about that person?
we
Who
all want
might
to be
that
the
person be? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Wait, can you hear me okay?
Now I
Yes,
can hear you.
hear you.
Thank you.
Okay. I feel like we all want to be the hero of our own story. We want to be the good guy. And here, like, God kind of explicitly says, if you tell yourself, oh, well, they messed up and, it's not my fault and I'm just being honest in my rating and review and whatever. And so God actually puts the power of righteousness into the hands of, this day laborer, kind of upending the power dynamic and saying he's going to call out to me. He's the one I'm going to listen to.
Yeah, so definitely God highlights God's relationship with this day laborer. What I wanted to underscore here is that in contrast to Vayikra, which, as we said, really underscores the re'acha, right? The belonging of the laborer to this community, this society that you're building. Here in Devarim, the verse specifically points out that this charge is relevant whether the laborer is a fellow Israelite or a stranger in one of the communities in your land. And the Hebrew is migercha asher be'artzecha, right? A stranger, a foreigner, as in a ger. We're not talking probably here about a ger tzedek, right? Someone who has converted, but somebody who is a resident alien. Yes, Nathan.
Hi, I don't know what sources you are going to bring in, but this summer I took a course with Professor Mari Lakshin, and he brought in this sounded familiar, and I thought it was going to say something, and then he showed us after showing this Exodus 22. Are you going to show us that?
No, I wasn't going to show, but please.
Where it says do not oppress the widows and the orphans, lest I get angry and kill you, and your wives will be widows and your children fatherless. And yeah, it seems like it's in conversation with that text. It sounds a lot like it.
Yeah. And this theme of sort of appealing to people's sense of morality, based on people's status, and also based on sort of the historical experience of the Israelite people, is a theme that definitely runs through these different texts as well. But again, here what I wanted to point out is that here in Devarim is that it's not specifically about people who belong to this inner narrow community, but the law is explicitly extended to the stranger as well. And going back to what we said beforehand, Devarim, as compared to Vayikra, Vayikra really seems to place the commandment or to charge the commandment as part of building an ethical and just society for the Israelite people. Devarim really focuses on the neediness, on the destitution, on the rights of the laborer to this particular to getting the wages on the same day that that he has worked, as part of, again, what needs to be taken care of specifically for the poor, specifically for the destitute. Which again was not the focus in Sefer Vayikra as well. Some scholars have pointed out that Sefer Devarim in general seems to be much more concerned with the poor, the needy, the destitute, than Sefer Vayikra, or than other books of the Torah. This is a theme that runs through many of the mitzvot, or the presentation of many mitzvot in Sefer Devarim. Which actually makes a certain amount of sense to the extent that Sefer Devarim is, again, it's most of Sefer Devarim is Moshe's final speech to the people as they prepare to enter Eretz Yisrael. As long as they were in the desert, there wasn't really a concept of needy and poor, right? Nobody was needy and poor because God provided for all of their needs. This raising the people's sensitivity to the fact that there will be these different, classes or financial gaps between elements of society is something that seems to be a particular concern of Sefer Devarim. Okay, with all of that in mind, I now want to go back to our mishnayot and the way that they treat this particular rule. Mishnah number 11 says, Sachir Yom, right, a day laborer, Goveh kol halayla, collects his wages from an employer all night, meaning assuming that this person ends their work shift at sundown, at the end of the day, then the employer has the entire next period, the entire next tkufa or ona, to return to pay up, right, to provide with the wages. And similarly, a night laborer collects his wages all of the following day, right? If someone was hired by the night period, then the employer has the entire following period after the conclusion of this labor to pay the wages. This is in contrast to an hourly laborer, right? Sachir sha'ot, who is allowed to collect his wages all night and all day. In other words, someone who is working by hour, the employer has a long rate. It wasn't a fixed period, and so the period is not what the following period is not the cutoff for providing the wages, but the employer has the entire following 24-hour cycle in order to provide it. And similarly, Sachir Shabbat here, which means not someone who was hired to work on Shabbat, but rather someone who was hired to work on a weekly basis. And that is as compared to a Sachir Chodesh, someone who hired to work on a monthly basis, Sachir Shana, who is hired to work for an entire year, or Sachir Shavua, which here doesn't mean week, but rather means an entire sabbatical cycle, entire Shemitah cycle. Yatsa bayom goveh kol hayom, yatsa balayla goveh kol halayla v'chol hayom. Right, if he left upon the completion of the work in the day, he collects his wages all day long, and if he left at night, he collects his wages all night and all day. And it's interesting here that these people who were hired to work for longer periods are still nonetheless considered these kinds of laborers, who really, the expectation is that the employer will pay them really immediately upon the completion of the work. This whole discussion of a day, a night, etc., is really just trying to define the deadline, right? And it's a very short deadline that the employer has to still be considered paying immediately upon completion of the work. This, of course, again, this is taking the concept that we saw in those verses in the Torah and trying to translate it into very concrete, detailed policy. Similarly, I just wanted to take a very quick look at, excuse me, I went a little bit too far, at Mishnah number 12, which again is continuing to discuss this concept of the providing the wages. Echad sachir, and here making a direct reference to the verses that we just saw in Devarim and in Vayikra. Echad schar adam ve'echad schar behema ve'echad schar kelim. This rule about paying wages immediately upon completion of the work doesn't only refer to a person's wages, it also refers to an animal who has been rented or utensils that have been rented for a very, short and fixed period of time. That also, that rental, those rental fees need to be paid immediately upon the completion of the work that they have rendered, as all of them are subject to this prohibition that we saw in Devarim, biyomo titen scharo, right? On the same day you give him the wages. V'yesh bo mishum lo talin peulat sachir itcha ad boker. They're all subject to those two mitzvot that we saw in both of those, in those two verses that we took a look at. Ematai, says the Mishnah, bizman shetivao. All of this applies, right, to the employer. This obligation applies to the employer when the laborer actually has asked for, has demanded his payment. Lo tivao eno over alav. But if the laborer did not claim the payment from the employee, then the owner does not transgress the prohibition, does not transgress the permission by not paying the money right away. And the Mishnah goes on, I don't want to discuss the remainder of it, about different arrangements that they might make with regards to a storekeeper, a money changer. These were people who functioned in their economy as types of banks, I suppose you could say. But without going into those, right, I just want to point out that this actually might be a little bit surprising, because based on the presentations that we saw in the Torah itself, it sounds like the charges were really ethical, sort of moral charges. And we wouldn't expect that it has anything to do with whether the laborer has asked for his wages, right? It should be an obligation. It sounds like from the Torah that the obligation is should be incumbent on the employer regardless, right? This principle of not leaving the person, not paying the person immediately, not letting the person wait until the next day. Sounds like it's just an ethical imperative, right? The idea is that this person needs the money, right? They don't, if they go home without receiving the money for the labor that they performed, they might literally not have any money at home, right? Their ability to buy food for their next meal is contingent on receiving the wages. So it doesn't sound from the Torah like this should have anything to do with whether the laborer asks for the wages or not. But here in this Mishnah, as in the previous Mishnah, I think what we're seeing here is the Mishnah sort of translating from a legal perspective, translating these ethical imperatives that we get in the Torah into pragmatic situations and trying to draw the lines as to when one is legally liable for these behaviors or for this lack of attentiveness, lack of transaction. And this is something I think that we've seen throughout Tractate Bava Metzia. We spoke about this in one of the very early shiurim, about the difference between the verses that we see in the Torah that underlie all of these halachot and the way that they translate into the Mishnah. That very often what we see is that the Torah provides, again, this sort of this underlying ethical imperative, and what the Mishnah is doing, as is Chazal's want, is translating it into sort of pragmatic and much more detailed situations and guidance, so that it can be used on a regular and daily basis, even in circumstances that are not ideal. And again, I'm just to remind you of those very first mishnayot that we saw about shnayim she'ochazim b'talit, right? We said that was the Mishnah's dealing with the law, the obligation to return lost property. In the Torah, it sounds like this, very lofty imperative to return a lost item, and the way that it gets dealt with in the Mishnah in that first chapter of Bava Metzia is about, two people who are grabbing onto the same thing, not about the lost object, but more about the ability, the rights of someone to claim the lost property. which again just underscores the difference between the way that many of these topics appear in the Torah in this, in often couched in an ethical guise, and the way that they appear in the Mishnah, which is much more pragmatic and day-to-day. As I said, because this is our last class, I want to give you just a very brief overview of chapter 10, which you should be starting to look at, to study today and in the coming couple of days. Chapter 10 is actually a very good bridge to the next Masechet and this next course of Mishnah, your next course of Mishnah Yomit, because chapter 10, the main subject of the chapter, which also has a refrain that repeats itself at least through the first several mishnayot, is really about neighbors. You can see here, we're just going to take a brief look at this very first Mishnah of the chapter. Habayit v'ha'aliyah shel shnayim shenaflu. We have a case where there's a house that has a lower story and an upper story that belong to two different people, and the house collapses. Right? The house collapses, and what do they do with they have all this material, all the material of the houses that collapse. And again, we're talking about, a world in which the building material itself is so valuable that people wouldn't just dispose of the collapsed house and begin anew, but they would gather all of these stones that the house had been built with in order to use them for any reconstruction purposes. So the house collapses. It had belonged to two different people. Who gets to keep the different stones or timber or whatever building materials survived the collapse? And the Mishnah here says, Shnehem cholkim ba'itzim u'va'avanim u'be'afar. They have to divide up all of these building materials. Viroim elu avanim ha'reuyot lehishtaber, and they consider which stones were likely to break, if it was more likely, based on the way that the house collapsed, that the broken stones belong to the upper story or to the lower story, then they would try to apportion those out in accordance. And the Mishnah goes on to say, if some person had distinctive stones that were part of his or her part of the house, then they could take those stones, but those stones are deducted from their total, right? Notlin ve'olot lo min hacheshbon, right? Those stones count towards his amount of stones, again, when they're dividing up these materials evenly. Just to give you a quick overview of the chapter, the next two mishnayot continue to deal with this situation where a house that had belonged to two people, an upper and lower story, collapses, and how do they deal with the rebuilding of that house. Mishnah 4 deals with a very similar situation, except here the neighbors are not residential neighbors. Rather, one has an olive press below a garden that belongs to the other. And again, the roof collapses, the roof of the olive press, that is the floor of the garden, collapses. And how do they deal with that situation? Mishnah 5 deals with a wall that collapses into a neighbor's property and who is responsible for all the building materials that are now all over the place. And Mishnah 6 deals with neighbors whose gardens are adjacent to one another. Again, as you can tell from this very quick overview of the Mishnayot, this is squarely Bava Batra territory, right? This is really Bava Batra, at least in terms of subject matter. As you will see when you move into the next Masechet later this week, the first chapter of Bava Batra continues right on discussing laws of neighbors and neighborly interactions. And I want to remind you here what we said at the very beginning of the course as well, which is that originally it seems very clear that these three tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, were all part of one much longer tractate Nezikin. And I'll remind you about how we discussed in our very first session different theories and different ideas about why they were divided in the way that they were divided. But the fact, this deep subject matter connection between this last chapter of Bava Metzia and the first one of Bava Batra really underscores that point. And just by way of closing, I wanted to very briefly remind you of the many different topics that we've covered over the course of the past 8 weeks. from ownership over an item that was claimed by two people, to laws of returning lost property, to safeguarding a deposit, and the rules of shomrim, different types of guardians or bailees, as they're sometimes called. In chapter 4, we spoke about the definition of money and exploitative financial transactions. In chapter 5, we focused on the laws of interest. Chapter 6 and chapter 7 were about hiring different kinds of laborers. Chapter 6, craftspeople or omnin, and as well as those omnin, those craft people's responsibility for damages they might cause in the course of their work, whereas chapter 7 was focused on po'alin. In chapter 8, we continued with our discussion of these different guardians or bailees and specifically focused on the responsibilities of a borrower. And in chapter 9, as we just studied together today, we focused on sharecroppers and on withholding wages. And now, as we just saw, chapter 10, promo to Tractate Bava Batra, the laws of neighbors. And I hope that very brief overview gives you a sense of fulfillment, of satisfaction in all of the different topics that we have managed in a relatively short time to at least begin to explore. So, Hadran Alach, Masechet Bava Metzia. I hope that this is an opportunity for you to continue with your learning, to come back to all of these topics and to delve into them more. Thanks very much. I enjoyed our learning together, and I hope that you did as well.
Thank you so much.